It was 2:14 a.m. when the call came through, a sound that always carried the weight of someone else's worst night. The tone in dispatch was clipped, urgent. Male, 42, unresponsive. Remote location off Highway 93. Possible cardiac arrest. Claire Mitchell, flight nurse, 15 years in trauma care, already had one hand on her flight helmet before the words had fully sunk in. The hangar doors opened to the cold Nevada night, and the roar of rotor blades drowned out everything else. The desert below was silent, endless, lit only by the scattered glow of emergency strobes. From above, it looked like a galaxy of dying stars. As the helicopter descended, the voices on the radio grew tense, local paramedics on the ground, struggling to keep a pulse. Claire's gloved fingers moved on instinct, prepping airway kits and IV lines. She had done this hundreds of times before, but something about this call, the quiet way the medic said, "He's not responding at all," made her chest tighten. The chopper touched down in a storm of dust and light. Claire jumped out, boots sinking into the cold sand. A man lay motionless on a stretcher, skin pale under the harsh beam of a flashlight. Jacob Miller, 42. No medical history, no trauma, just stopped. She checked his carotid pulse. Barely there, a whisper beneath her fingertips. His pupils reacted, but slowly, as if his body was caught between worlds. "Let's move," she shouted, and within seconds they were airborne again, slicing through the black sky. In the confined space, every sound became sharper. The beeping of the monitor, the rush of oxygen, the rhythmic hiss of the ventilator. Claire worked quickly, pushing epinephrine, starting compressions when the monitor flattened into a deadly straight line. "Come on, Jacob," she muttered, voice steady though her pulse pounded in her ears. "So don't you do this to me." At 2:41 a.m., Jacob's heart stopped completely. They shocked him once, twice. Nothing. The cabin lights flickered red, illuminating the desperation on every face. The pilot's voice crackled through the headset. 5 minutes to hospital. Claire kept compressing, sweat soaking through her collar despite the cold. When they landed, the doctor on board shook his head. "We've lost him," he said softly. Claire froze. For a second, all she could hear was the faint whine of the rotors slowing down. She called it herself. Time of death, 2:53 a.m. And then everything changed. The monitor beside her, a screen that had been lifeless seconds before, flickered. Once, twice. A faint waveform appeared, irregular but unmistakable. A beat, then another. Claire's head snapped toward Jacob's body. His chest rose. His eyes, clouded only minutes before, snapped open with a sharp gasp that echoed through the cabin. For a moment, everyone just stared. The impossible had happened. The man they had declared dead was breathing, his pulse strong. His gaze focused directly on Claire. She couldn't speak. Her mind reached for explanations, for logic. Electrical interference? Mechanical error? But the monitor continued to pulse with steady rhythm. The color returned to his face. He was alive. Later, Claire would replay that night endlessly, trying to understand the impossible moment between his last breath and his first. How death could feel so final 1 second and then undone the next. The hospital was a different kind of chaos, bright, sterile, and unrelenting. As the helicopter touched down on the rooftop pad, the trauma team was already waiting. The doors burst open, and Jacob Miller was rushed inside, his body pale beneath the harsh, fluorescent light. His pulse was steady now, but his breathing was shallow. Machines hummed and beeped as if trying to make sense of him, to confirm that he was, in fact, alive. Claire followed the gurney down the corridor, her mind still looping the moment he'd gasped awake. She'd seen spontaneous circulation return before, rare, but not impossible. Yet this was different. There had been no residual cardiac activity, no hint of a pulse. He had been gone. And still, here he was. In Trauma Room 3, doctors and nurses swarmed around Jacob, calling out vitals, adjusting monitors, checking pupils. Claire stood back, hands trembling. Dr. Patel, the attending physician, glanced at her. "You called time?" he asked. She nodded silently. "And he came back?" She nodded again. His eyes flickered with disbelief, but there wasn't time to argue. They focused on stabilizing him. Fluids, oxygen, monitoring for brain damage. Hours passed before the storm of activity settled into a cautious calm. Jacob was alive, though his EEG showed significant slowing, signs of hypoxia, a lack of oxygen to the brain. The prognosis wasn't clear. He might never regain full awareness. But then, sometime near dawn, his eyelids began to flutter. A nurse leaned over him gently. "Jacob, can you hear me?" he nodded. And then with effort, he spoke. His voice was hoarse, but the words were sharp enough to make every person in the room freeze. "Claire," he whispered. "Don't stop compressions." Claire's heart stopped cold. He shouldn't have remembered that. Not the name, not the words. Those were things spoken after his heart had stopped, when, medically, there should have been nothing. No hearing, no seeing, no awareness. When questioned later, Jacob described the helicopter in unnerving detail. The red glow of the cabin lights, the sound of the defibrillator charging, even the faint scent of jet fuel in the air. He recalled watching his own body from above, detached but aware, seeing Claire leaning over him with determination in her eyes. You said you weren't going to let me go, he told her softly. I saw you. The room fell silent. Claire didn't know how to respond. Every piece of medical training told her that what he was describing was impossible. During cardiac arrest, the brain is deprived of oxygen within seconds. After a few minutes, neural activity ceases. Conscious perception should be gone, and yet here was a man describing events that occurred after death. Some of the doctors suggested peri-mortem hallucination, a dreamlike experience occurring in the final moments before brain shutdown. But the precision of his recollection unsettled even the skeptics. The exact phrasing, the color of the gloves she wore, the beeping of the monitor that only she could hear through her headset. When Jacob turned to her and said, "You were scared?" Claire's breath caught in her throat. He was right. For the first time in years, she had been scared. What began as a miracle revival was quickly becoming something else, a riddle that refused to fit neatly inside the boundaries of medicine. Jacob Miller had died, then lived, and somehow, in the space between, he had seen everything. That was the night she stopped believing medicine could explain everything. In the weeks that followed, Claire Mitchell found herself haunted by that night. On the surface, life returned to routine. Flight calls, night shifts, the familiar drone of helicopter blades cutting through the sky. But something inside her had shifted. The moment Jacob's eyes had opened after death replayed again and again, looping in her mind like a film she couldn't turn off. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw it. The flicker of the monitor, the impossible gasp of air, the stunned silence that followed. Sitting in the quiet of her apartment, Claire began writing in her journal, a habit she'd started after her first trauma case years ago. The entries from that week were different, though. They weren't about protocol or reflection. They were confessions. "I've seen life return," one entry read, "but not like this." It was as if something came back into him, like the air shifted right before he breathed. When she finally agreed to speak on camera for the documentary, she sat in a dimly lit room, her voice trembling, her eyes heavy with the weight of memory. "I've seen people die," she said quietly. "I've held their hands as the monitor went silent. But that night, what happened with Jacob, it broke something in me, because I knew he was gone. I felt it." She paused as though searching for words that didn't exist. And then I felt something else. The air inside the cabin changed. It got heavy and then light again. I can't explain it, but it was like something passed through. The confession was raw, unfiltered. Years of scientific certainty unraveling in real time. Claire spoke about how she couldn't sleep for days after the incident, how she'd wake up in the middle of the night hearing phantom beeps, heart monitors that weren't really there. I kept thinking, she whispered, "What if death isn't what we think it is?" Her colleagues tried to reassure her. They told her it was adrenaline, exhaustion, the emotional toll of the job, but none of those explanations quieted the unease that had settled in her chest. "When you spend your life saving people," she said, "you build walls between yourself and the mystery of what happens after. You have to. Otherwise, you'd fall apart." But Jacob's case, it tore a hole right through that wall. She remembered going back to the hangar days later, standing beside the same helicopter. It was quiet, almost reverent. She placed her hand on the metal fuselage, the cold surface grounding her. "This machine has carried hundreds of dying people," she murmured. "It's where life ends and sometimes begins again. But that night, I swear I felt both happening at once." Her voice faltered, but she didn't look away from the camera. "People think nurses see miracles all the time. We don't. We see math, numbers, vitals, reactions. But that night wasn't math. It was something else entirely. Something that makes me question everything I thought I knew." In her journal, one final line stood out. "I brought him back to life. But maybe he was never really gone. In medicine, there's always an explanation." That's what Claire had been taught from the start. Every symptom, every outcome, every heartbeat had a reason. But the deeper doctors dug into Jacob Miller's case, the more those reasons began to unravel. The documentary shifts tone here, trading emotion for inquiry. White coats, clinical light, the quiet hum of machines in a neurology lab. A narrator's voice overlays the sterile imagery. What happens to the human brain in the moments after death? And how could a man with no heartbeat, no oxygen, no measurable activity, describe his own resuscitation? Dr. Aaron Levine, a neurologist who's studied near-death experiences for over a decade, appears on screen. And when the heart stops, the brain is starved of oxygen. Within 20 seconds, you lose consciousness. Within 2 to 3 minutes, brain activity should cease. Beyond that point, the neurons begin to die. There shouldn't be awareness. There shouldn't be memory. But Jacob's EEG told a different story. His cardiac arrest lasted over 7 minutes, far too long for any coherent recall. Yet, when they reviewed the flight data, his descriptions matched reality precisely. The exact moment the monitor flatlined, the call time, even the number of shocks delivered. Doctors tried to anchor the impossible to science. Some called it auto-resuscitation, a rare phenomenon where spontaneous circulation returns minutes after CPR stops. Others proposed residual electrical activity, a fading echo in the brain that might spark temporary perception. But even these explanations couldn't account for the vividness of Jacob's account. His recollections weren't fragmented or dreamlike. They were structured, sequential, conscious. Dr. Levine leaned forward during his interview, his tone both cautious and intrigued. We have data from patients who've reported similar experiences during cardiac arrest. Visual, auditory awareness that aligns with medical events occurring after their clinical death. We're beginning to suspect there may be a brief window, a kind of twilight, where consciousness lingers even when the body has stopped. To help the audience visualize, the documentary shows a glowing animation of a brain shutting down. Neurons fire like fading stars, one by one, until only a few sparks remain. A single flicker continues longer than expected, a visual metaphor for Jacob's impossible awareness. Then the narration softens, almost philosophical. Perhaps death is not an on-off switch, but a dimmer. A slow fading of the light we still don't fully understand. Still, science demands proof. Jacob's case was reviewed by independent researchers. Each came to the same uneasy conclusion. His memories should not exist. And yet, they did. Even Dr. Patel, Jacob's attending physician, the same man who had declared his death, admitted in his interview, "I've worked 25 years in emergency medicine. I've seen every kind of revival. But this doesn't fit. He wasn't supposed to come back, let alone remember what happened after he died. There's no mechanism for that." As the segment closes, the camera lingers on Claire, listening to the expert speak. For the first time, she realizes she's not alone in her disbelief. Even science, for all its certainty, sometimes looks into the abyss and finds no answer waiting. When Jacob Miller finally agreed to be interviewed, months had passed since that night in the Nevada desert. He was thinner now, quieter. The lines around his eyes carried something deeper than age, something closer to reverence. The camera found him sitting on a park bench at sunrise, a soft breeze stirring the leaves around him. "I still don't know why I came back," he said. "But I know what I saw. And I know it wasn't a dream." His hands trembled slightly as he spoke, his voice low but certain. He described the moment of collapse, the sudden stillness. "Well, 1 second. I was standing outside my truck, and then everything went black. Not dark, just nothing. No pain, no panic. It was quiet, but not empty. Then I realized I wasn't gone. I was somewhere else, watching." He told the story slowly, each word deliberate. "I could see the helicopter. I saw the lights, the crew. I saw her, Claire, working on me. The red light made her look like she was underwater. I remember thinking, she's fighting so hard for someone who's already gone." He paused, his eyes distant. "I wanted to tell her I could hear her, that I wasn't afraid. But I couldn't move. I couldn't speak." Jacob described what came after. A vast space, neither light nor dark, filled with what he called a kind of knowing. There were no voices, no faces, just a feeling of being part of something immeasurably large and calm. "It wasn't heaven or anything I can name," he said. "But I felt peace. And somewhere far away, I heard her voice. She said, 'I'm not letting you go.' And suddenly it was like being pulled backward, through water, through noise, and I woke up." The narration contrasts his serenity with stark medical footage of the resuscitation, the pounding of compressions, the shock of defibrillation, the mechanical rhythm of life and death colliding. The juxtaposition is brutal and beautiful. His wife, Melissa, sits beside him in the next shot, eyes glistening. "When they told me he had died, I felt my whole world collapse," she says softly. "And then an hour later, they called back and said he was alive. I didn't know whether to cry or pray." She smiles faintly. "He's different now, calmer, quieter. He doesn't get angry anymore." Their teenage daughter, Emma, adds in a trembling voice, "Sometimes he just stares out the window. He says he feels like he's between two places." Jacob nods gently. "I don't feel like the same person. I'm grateful to be alive, but I also miss that peace. I know it sounds strange, but dying wasn't the worst thing that's ever happened to me. It was the most real thing I've ever felt." He looks into the camera, steady now. "Before this, I believed what we all believe, that death is the end. But now I'm not sure it is. I think it's just a door. And for some reason, I wasn't allowed to walk through it yet." The scene fades on his face, haunted, peaceful, alive. A man who has seen beyond and returned, still searching for the language to describe what waits on the other side. Months later, they met again. The hospital cafeteria was quiet that afternoon, the hum of vending machines and distant footsteps echoing through the empty halls. Claire sat at a corner table, fidgeting with her coffee cup. When Jacob walked in, she stood instinctively. For a moment, neither spoke. They just looked at each other, two people forever bound by something that neither could explain. "It's good to finally see you," Jacob said softly, his voice steady but gentle. "I've wanted to thank you." Claire shook her head. "Don't thank me. I didn't bring you back." He smiled faintly. "Maybe not, but you didn't let me go." They sat together for over an hour, talking quietly. She told him how that night had shaken her, how she'd tried to rationalize every detail. "I kept thinking maybe the equipment malfunctioned," she admitted. "Maybe I misread something. But the more I tried to make it make sense, the less it did." Jacob listened, patient. I don't think it was an accident, he said finally. I think, whatever you did, it mattered. Maybe it was your voice that pulled me back. I don't remember much before that, but I remember you. The sound of you saying my name. Claire stared down at her hands. I still don't understand how you could have heard me. You had no heartbeat, no oxygen. We were gone for 7 minutes. He nodded. I know, but I wasn't gone. The conversation drifted into quieter places, philosophy, faith, the boundaries of consciousness. Jacob spoke about the stillness he'd felt, the way awareness had stretched beyond his body. Claire admitted she'd started reading medical journals about near-death experiences, searching for explanations. Most studies agreed. A brief window of residual brain activity could cause hallucinations, but Jacob's memories didn't feel like hallucinations to her. They felt intentional. Dr. Levine's voice overlays the scene, analytical yet reverent. The question we face isn't just whether consciousness survives death. It's whether consciousness might not be entirely dependent on the brain at all. Perhaps it exists separately, tethered somehow, lingering until it's truly released. Back in the cafeteria, Claire finally broke the silence. Do you ever wonder why you came back? Jacob took a long breath. Every day. But I think I was supposed to. Maybe not for something big or dramatic. Maybe just to tell people not to be so afraid. Death isn't what we think. For a long time, neither spoke again. The hum of the hospital filled the silence between them. Then Claire whispered, almost to herself, I can resuscitate a body. I can bring back a heartbeat. But whatever it was that brought you back, I'll never know. Jacob looked at her then, a quiet understanding passing between them. In that moment, they both knew. They had stood on opposite sides of something no human was meant to see, and somehow returned together. The camera opens on the soft light of dawn spilling across an empty helicopter hangar. The engines are silent now, the echo of rotor blades long gone. Claire Mitchell stands alone by the aircraft, her hand resting on the cool metal of its frame. For years, this place had been a symbol of control, of precision, of action, of saving lives. But now, as the morning sun stretches over the desert horizon, it feels like something else entirely, a place where science and mystery coexist in uneasy silence. Her voice returns in narration, low and reflective. I used to think life and death were simple. You fight or you don't. You win or you lose. But that night with Jacob taught me that maybe it's not a battle at all. Maybe it's a passage. The camera pans across empty stretchers, coiled wires, and silent monitors. Claire's tone carries both reverence and fatigue. When I called time of death that night, I felt it in my bones. He was gone. I'd seen hundreds of deaths before, but this one felt different. And when he came back, when his eyes opened, I realized something that still keeps me awake. Maybe death isn't final. Maybe it's just quiet. A soft pause. Then Jacob's voice fades in, recorded from his final interview. We think. We understand everything because we can measure it. Heartbeats, blood pressure, oxygen levels. But consciousness? It's not something you can measure. It's something you feel. I think I crossed over. I think I saw what waits. And it wasn't dark. It was beautiful. Cut to footage of Claire walking down a hospital corridor, the faint sound of distant monitors pulsing like fading stars. Her narration continues. I've asked myself 1,000 times what I could have done differently that night, but maybe there was nothing to change. Maybe it all happened exactly as it was meant to. Some things you just can't explain. You just witness them, and they change you. Dr. Levine appears briefly once more, offering what little science can give. In the end, what Jacob experienced may never be fully explained. It may exist in that narrow space between medicine and mystery. But as doctors, our role isn't to define the unknown, it's to learn from it. The final moments are quiet. Claire sits in the open door of the helicopter watching the sunrise. Her voice softens to a whisper. I've held dying hands more times than I can count. I've watched life slip away, sometimes peacefully, sometimes not. But Jacob reminded me, death isn't just an ending. Sometimes it's a threshold. And what waits beyond might not be darkness at all. The faint hum of a heart monitor fades into silence, then one final soft beep. Steady, alive. The camera lingers on the empty cockpit, light pouring through the glass like a quiet blessing. A final on-screen caption appears, based on true accounts shared by emergency medical flight crews. Names and details have been changed for privacy. As the screen fades to black, the narration ends on a single thought, barely audible. Maybe we never really lose them. Maybe, for a moment, they just step beyond the reach of our hands. And with that, only silence remains.